Welcome everybody. My name is Roger Mackenzie. My day job, I'm one of the Assistant General Secretaries of Unison. In case you don't know what that is, that's the largest and the best trade union in the country. And in my other life, I'm got the great honour to be the chair of the Bernie Grant Trust as well, which is the most important thing for tonight. It's really a big deal for me, actually, to be chair of the Bernie Grant Trust, not least of which is because of the person that I'm following as chair. This introduction would normally have been done by my great friend and mentor and comrade, Narendra Mukherjee. And Narendra left us to join the ancestors last year. And many of you, I guess, would have been in this room to celebrate his contribution to our movement, and his great friend, great comrade, but did so much to help build this trust. And can I just acknowledge the presence here of Hashmukh Mukherjee, who's with us. Well, you've got to stand up and stuff and just take some. I learned a long time ago, somebody starts applauding, you stand up and you milk it for all you're kind of with it. It might have even been Bernie or even Jeremy that kind of taught me that one, I don't know. This has really been a really big year for the Trust. And tonight's gathering, community really, isn't just about looking backwards and just reminiscing about the past. I think it's important to think of this as really trying to reinvigorate ourselves and to learn from the challenges that we went through in the past, and to look at how we can apply those things for the massive challenges that we now face. We know that, all of us know, that one of the big challenges, one of the big contributions that Bernie made all those years ago was raising the level of debate, raising the level of activity around anti-racism, standing up for black people, standing up for black self-organisation. I tell you, you don't need me to tell you that that message, that challenge is still on the agenda today, probably larger than it's ever been, where we have a Prime Minister that thinks it's okay to insult black people in the way that he does, where he insults people of the Islamic tradition in the way that he does. And I'm not going to repeat those things. All I will say is I remember what Bernie told me years and years ago, is that if we don't stand up together, if we don't organise together, then nobody's going to do that for us. And if we want to stand up against the racism that we see from this government today, we have to stand up together. Yes? So it has been a big year for the Trust. We've engaged in over 60 or so young people with what is really an amazing Bernie Grant archive. Our heritage ambassadors have recorded almost 100 interviews with people to record their memories of the anti-racist struggles of the 80s and the 90s. Seminal years for me, really, and I think back to those times really often about the things that used to get thrown through our letterboxes. Letter bombs, the dog mess that used to get thrown through our letterboxes, the attacks on the streets that we used to have to endure, all too familiar again today. And that's why it's important that we remember that this isn't about looking back, but it's about remembering that some of these things, many of these things, are still with us and demand our attention to fight back. But also, and perhaps more importantly, yesterday, the Bernie Grant Trust launched our educational resources for schools in the House of Commons. We have a problem in that so many of our schools, the evidence of the black presence in our society is either diminished or completely left out altogether, or just left for 1 month of the year called Black History Month, and is never talked about any other time. We really do need to put the black curriculum back in the agenda. And I think the resources that we launched yesterday will enable them to start to do that. There are no excuses now where schools can turn around and say, we didn't know about that. We haven't got the resources. We don't know where they're coming from. They've got the resources now, and we have to make sure that they are used in as many schools as is possible. I want to recognise the work of Michelle Bogues and Helen Sanson for the huge amount of work involved in what they did to make all of that work happen. Look on Twitter, look on social media to see the link to the resources. But I'll mention some names, and you need to give these people a big shout out because they did an enormous amount of work. Thank you. We've also managed to acquire the archives of the legendary, I think, Narendra Mukherjee. Now being catalogued, Sharon and myself went and saw some of this stuff, and it's truly remarkable. I even had hair in those days, which, like a big Angela Davis afro thing going on. It was like, maybe not quite, but anyway. But these are remarkable resources, a remarkable archive that we can use, an amazing source for anyone interested in the race equality campaigns that Narendra and so many of us in this room were involved in over the past few decades. There's a this is labour-intensive work, and we want to do much more from our trust. We run on a shoestring, you've guessed it, this is the appeal. We run on a shoestring, no paid staff, this is all done voluntarily. If you're able to help us by making a small regular donation to the Trust, please do that. I think there's some the standing orders and the rest of it are around the building. If not on your seats, then they're at the front. Please do what you can to help maintain this work. I think you know that it's really important work that's being done. No doubt, towards the end of the evening, I'll come back again and I'll make yet another appeal for some more money. But I think it's time we started the proceedings, yes? Yeah. Most people at Unison say, shut up, Roger, it's time to get on with the real business. And this is what we're going to do. So I want to call to the front and encourage you all to give a big welcome to Councillor Joe Ejiofor, who's Haringey's council leader, who continues in that tradition that Bernie is going to join us. And also Hannah Poole, the Chief Executive of the Bernie Grant Arts Centre.
Thank you, Roger. I'm Hannah Poole. I'm the CEO and Artistic Director here at the Bernie Grant Arts Centre. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Thank you so much for braving the apocalypse to join us. We are proud to be part of Bernie's legacy. A truly diverse arts centre that celebrates his beloved Tottenham and champions black artists telling our own stories. But we can't do it without you, so please do support us. Come and see our shows, help us with fundraising, and if there's anybody in the room who is really passionate about the work we're doing here, we are looking for board members, so you can either speak to reception or you can email me at ceo@berniegrantcentre.co.uk. But for now, the world is a lot right now, so for the next few hours, please just let the beautiful, radical spirit of Bernie feed your soul.
I'm just here to say a few words to welcome you to Tottenham. Tottenham was a place that was a great passion for Bernie. The people who are here, the nature of the area, the supportive, the passion for the left came from the people who were here, and some of these people are still here now. And you know, Jeremy, who at some time knocked on doors with some guy called Mackenzie who had hair apparently. And The reality is that I don't think I would have been the leader of this council if it wasn't for the fact that Bernie opened the door. He opened the door for black people, he opened the door for the party that we love to be much more inviting to the people that voted for it. And that's the change. I look at where I am now, as a black councillor, as a leader of Haringey Council. I am the 7th black councillor ever to lead a local authority. The 7th. To put that in context, there are more than 300 local authorities in this country, and there are more than 7 Asian council leaders at this time, here and now. So, you know, the fact that Bernie opened the door for us, and with the Bernie Grant Fellowship, which is taking other young people, giving other young black people the opportunity to get support, to become young politicians. I think that again is something that we need to support. But I'm just here for a quick moment because I know that there are people who are much more important than me who we come here to listen to speak today. The lecture is really important, not just for the politics that we talk about, but also for the legacy of Bernie. And this isn't going to be the last, it's going to be one of many, 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 and I'm going to try my best to come to every single one of them, and I hope that you will too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. Real tribute to the legacy of Bernie. The next speaker that I'd like to invite up really needs no introduction to this constituency. I think one of the most important black politicians in this country, and I'd like to give a real warm welcome to the Right Honourable David Lammy, MP for Tottenham.
In the spirit of Bernie, I'm wearing this T-shirt. Black history is British history. We like this one. Can I just say that this is one of those moments when you recognise just how special the N15 and N17 postcode is, and how this unique place, relatively small place, in this bit of London makes the most enormous imprint on our country and the world. I so wished that Bernie would have been alive to see his great friend Jeremy Corbyn become leader of the Labour Party. I wish that he had been by my side when we revealed the injustice that this government had done to the Windrush generation.
Bernie's proud of you.
And I so wish that he were there with his humour and that powerful, powerful voice looking down at Boris Johnson and speaking truth to power about the tide that's come across from Donald Trump. But his legacy is real. This centre and the trust is an enormous part of equipping now our young people, but so many of us with remembering what he gave us. And at this time of such, and many of us are shocked, frankly, by the populist nationalism, the xenophobia, the mainstreaming of racism, and the re-emergence of white supremacy celebrated in our country and across much of the world. And so the fight that Bernie took, his internationalism, the pride he filled us. I remember vividly, not just the moment when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison, but the pride that Bernie was there. And so this is a wonderful way to think about that legacy. And it really, there is no one more appropriate than Jeremy Corbyn to deliver this lecture. It's really because of that relationship and that friendship that back in 2015, when Jeremy was what would you describe as on the fringes of the Parliamentary Labour Party, I said to Jeremy, please will you come up and launch my election campaign in Tottenham? And being Jeremy, up the high road he came with his bicycle and he launched my campaign. A couple of years later, we got out of that election, so it wasn't a couple of years, it was a month or so later, and he said, David, I need your support. I said, what do you need my support for? He said, I want to be on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Of course, I'll give you my support. And then shortly after that, I want to lead the Labour Party. It's because of these relationships, it's because of these histories, and what the South Africans so wonderfully articulated, the struggle that we're all here in a spirit of kinship with Bernie Grant. I'm very, very grateful that Jeremy Corbyn has given up his time to deliver this lecture. I know the words are going to be powerful. I can't wait for every single sentence. And I hope that in time, this speech and a few others will be published by the man who has led the Labour Party in this last period. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. We're going to have a video tribute next. This is where you kind of hope that the technology works. I'm sure it will in here. So this is from a key figure who chaired the inquiry into the disturbances in Tottenham in 1985 and was involved in the reparations movement that Bernie began, which I was also part of all those years ago as well. So it's a video tribute from Lord Anthony Gifford.
Greetings to everybody. Greetings to Sharon Grant. And congratulations, Sharon, on your work with the Bernie Grant Trust. Greetings to everyone in the audience. Greetings to Jeremy Corbyn. And these greetings, of course, come from Jamaica. I knew Bernie from 1985, when he was leader of the Haringey Council, in the aftermath of the Borderwater Farm riots, uprising, whatever you call it. He was determined that the deaths of Cynthia Jarrett and Keith Blakelock should be investigated by an official inquiry. He asked the government, but they refused. And so he took the initiative as leader of the council to ask me to lead a team which conducted the inquiry. It was a worthwhile venture. It's important to note that Bernie, that it was an act of leadership on Bernie's part. He was a leader in everything that he did. He acted against injustice. He didn't just speak about it. So he became a member of Parliament in 1987. And what a member he was. He seemed to be the representative of the whole African diaspora in Parliament. He founded the African reparations movement. This was at a time when reparations was hardly known about outside the Rastafari community. But Bernie saw that Britain had to come to terms and make amends and genuinely apologize for the horrors which they perpetrated over centuries in Africa and in the Caribbean. So that he introduced me to a cause which has been my cause as well ever since. And he would be glad to know that in the Caribbean we've had reparations councils and commissions set up in every island, every country. And CARICOM also has a reparations commission. There's a lot of, as you know, grassroots activity going on in the UK, in America. Reparations is here to stay as an issue. It won't go away. In fact, I think today that given the emergence, the re-emergence of the blatant racism which has come to the fore in the Brexit campaigns and in the Trump presidency. I think we have to think even more deeply about the concept of reparation. I see it, as I think Bernie would have done, as a process whereby the two sides come together. Everyone has been harmed by this awful history. Jamaica suffered trauma which has lasted 2 generations, sees itself in violence and in the infidelities which take place. But Britain is also sick with racism, and it's time that we confronted this in a process whereby both sides decide how to repair the damage. That is what reparation is about. So Bernie, we will continue your work. We honour you and we miss you. Goodbye to everybody.
We're going to continue the tributes for a little while. We've got a tribute from the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, which is going to be read by Sean O'Donovan, which is in recognition of the alliances Bernie built with the black people and the Irish. So please welcome Sean.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Sean O'Donovan and I worked for Bernie for many years, and it's good to see other people here that work with Bernie and are associated with him. And I still meet people whose lives are better because of the work that Bernie did. He told everyone in Tottenham that nobody can put a limit on the ambitions of young people. And he inspired those people to become community leaders, councillors, leaders of the council, MPs, leaders of the Labour Party. And one great friend of his and Sharon, regrets not being here, but he did send a personal tribute. That's my president, Anukwanda Aaron, President Michael D. Higgins, the elected head of state of Ireland, who was elected twice on an overwhelming mandate. Bernie, as people probably know, he learnt a lot about Ireland from nuns in Guyana when he was growing up. He used to tell me he didn't learn a lot about religion, but he knew about Irish history and Irish music, and it gave him a great love for Ireland. When Michael and Sharon met, Sharon and Bernie met, they hit it off immediately. Michael D. Higgins was a great fighter against injustice, but he also knew that culture, humour and fun was a vital part of life as well. Those days of discussions between Sharon, Michael D. Higgins and Bernie were inspirational, but their evenings out in Dublin and London were legendary. Michael, after he became president, he visited Tottenham Irish Centre, and he does love the area. And he told me when he first walked in to the park as president, he did feel the presence of Bernie with him. And he himself wrote this tribute despite an incredible hard working life that he has at the moment. This is from Anukwanda Aaron, President of Ireland. Dear fellow friends of Bernie Grant, I have the warmest memories of the great big heart of Bernie Grant. When I visited at his invitation Tottenham and Brent, it was to speak of racial stereotypes and their destructive effect on communities. We sought to build a green and black alliance to deal with Mrs. Thatcher's cuts to important services. You can boo Mrs. Thatcher if you like. Bernie and I spoke of Montserrat, the Caribbean and Latin America, and the rights of migrants from wherever they come. Bernie was always in the vanguard for workers and trade union rights. Bernie was a true internationalist, supporting struggles ignored or forgotten. He was of strong opinion, and he was loved for the great socialist, humanist and world citizens he was. 2 decades after his sad passing, I can still picture him on our discussions of Montserrat and his deep concern for the Montserrat people who longed for their beautiful island from the balconies of their high-rise flats in Tottenham. He also wanted to pass on his admiration, eternal friendship and love to Sharon, the people of Tottenham, and everyone here tonight remembering Bernie. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I feel actually really kind of bathed in, I know, there's all of these people, there's loads of people in this room who have been kind of seminal to me personally as well in my life, not just politically like Bernie, like Jeremy, but also the legendary Martha Ossamore down there as well. But also the next person who I'm going to introduce, I have to tell you, I never, ever in my life thought I would ever get to introduce this person. Never, right? So this is a real big deal for me, as is the whole of this evening. Widely regarded as the father of dub poetry, and I think rightly so, yeah? And the first black poet to be published by Penguin, and well known for the enduring power of his work, power and majesty of his work, I would say. He wrote his poem Bernie Grant in memoriam shortly after Bernie died in 2000. And for so many, it sums up the deep sense of the loss of a leader that so many in the community felt at that particular time, and I would say still feel to this day. It's great, great pleasure to introduce Linton Kwesi Johnson.
Good evening. I first met Bernie Grant in 1987 when I worked as a reporter for a TV program called The Bandung File on Channel 4. The program was edited by Darcus Howe and Tariq Ali, and that was in the good old days of multiculturalism. What astonished me during my coverage of his election campaign was how broad the support he had in the constituency. All ethnic groups were for Bernie Grant. And, you know, we've come a long way since 1987 when it was Bernie Grant, Diana Abbott, Paul Boateng and Keith Vaz. We've come a long way since then. And when Bernie passed and David Lammy became the new MP for Tottenham, I said, oh, who is this youth? He's not ready yet. Because Bernie had, of course, set the bar very high indeed. I mean, of the 4 members of parliament that were elected that year, Bernie was the only one who had genuine, real, genuine grassroots support across the country, not just here in Tottenham. So, but I have been pleasantly surprised by David Lammy. I've had to eat my words. I think it's splendid the way he stepped up to the plate. So this is the poem I wrote for Bernie. I should just say, just before I recite this poem, that for years, I've been in this country since 1963, and I never voted once in a general election. I voted in local elections. I voted for Ken Livingstone, for the mayor, and all of that. And it was only when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, I felt that at least now I have a real choice. And that was the first time I ever voted Labour in a general election. Anyway, here's the poem, BG, for Bernie Grant in memoriam, 1934 to 2000. Like a skilled tradesman you paved the way from the shop floor to the council chamber, all the way up to Parliament front door. And then you enter as a member. And we remember the eruption over Tottenham, Mrs. Jarrett heart attack. Down at Brixton, Detective Lovelock shot Cherry Gross in her back. The rage and the storm, the death of PC, Blakelock, Broadwater Farm. You was with Chief, you was with Choice, you was with Champion, you was with Face, you was with Vice, you was with Main Man. And we remember how the press and the rest try to lynch you, how them try to tar and feather you, how the Haringey massive rally round you, how you make black people feel proud of you. And we remember how you build the unity in your community, dedicate yourself to your constituency, brace your broad back against bigotry, and stand firm for justice and equality. You was with Chief, you was with Choice, you was with Champion, you was with Face, you was with Vice, you was with Main Man. Them say that if you're going into politics, you have to well tough and can take enough licks. You was with Ali in I'm prime. You jab them with your left, you hook them with your right, and you take truth force and beat them every time. Now it sound like louder bells are told with tail, but I feel President are going to prevail. Them don't know how the past and get him gone, but I'll know me still a hear for your sound. You was with Chief, you was with Choice, you was with Champion, you was with Face, you was with Vice, you was with Number One.
Well, that's incredible. Yeah? Yes. Yeah, incredible. Now, if you want to, you can buy copies of that poem on a poster that's at the front of the building. So please do buy copies of that and persuade other people. Buy copies for your friends as well. You know, I mean, that's a powerful, powerful statement about Bernie, isn't it? Yeah. But it's also a powerful, powerful statement about all of us and about what we need from people who say that they're going to stand up and represent us in that place called Parliament, isn't it? You know? And so let's please get the message out there and please go out and buy that poster. We come to the main event of the evening now. There's only one person I can think who can top that, really. I mean, Sharon, I mean, you did well in drawing up this, right, because that's in exactly the right order. Actually, Sharon's been mentioned a few times, and I think we have to thank Sharon for all the work that she did. So, as many years ago, and yes, I had hair in those days still at that particular time, that I went to live in Islington North, and I met this guy. I think he splashed me on his bike or something as he went past me. And he eventually persuaded me to be his constituency secretary. I have to say I wasn't the best constituency secretary. I was eager and willing to try and learn and stuff. But it was a time when there was a lot of politics around and a lot of energy. And you've got to say that a lot of the problems I think that we face politically, there's a lack of energy and a lack of commitment and a lack of real commitment to what is actually happening to working class people on the ground in our communities. I don't think anybody could ever say that the person I'm about to introduce doesn't understand and get that entirely. And I think if there was any justice in this world, I would be introducing to you the Prime Minister of this country. What many of you may not realise is that Jeremy is has been a close ally of Bernie's for many, many years, 30 years or more. They work together in what and I'll probably get sacked from Unison for saying this, but what I think was the best trade union that ever existed, which is called the National Union of Public Employees. They were both officials within that. They work together at a local level as councillors in the London Borough of Haringey, and both at the same time became colleagues, became comrades in that den called the Houses of Parliament, when they were both, one was a member for Islington North and the other a member for Tottenham, as we've heard tonight. Colleagues, give a really, really big, warm welcome to Jeremy Corbyn, MP.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Before I start the lecture, I think it's right that we should say something about coronavirus. No, we should. It's serious. We've got to work together to overcome this outbreak, and we'll only overcome it thanks to the dedication of National Health Service staff, carers and public servants. But we've got to be straight with people that it's going to be much tougher to overcome it because of 10 years of austerity and cuts, counterproductive cuts to all of our public services. There's a lesson here because we're going into this crisis with our public services on their knees. The package the government has announced in the budget is full of holes for workers, especially for BAME workers. Research from the TUC found black workers were twice as likely as average to be in temporary work and much more likely to be on 0 hours contracts. These are precisely the workers now deeply worried because there's been no guarantee that statutory sick pay will be made available to 0 hours contracts workers or those without any contract of employment at all. It's BAME workers who will be disproportionately hit due to the government's lack of action. So I simply say this to Boris Johnson: don't hang BAME workers out to dry in this crisis. Those and migrant workers, particularly women, are on the front line of the battle against coronavirus in our stretched social care and health services. The government must make sure they are supported. And this scandalously low level of SSP at £94 a week compared to, and we just heard from Michael D, the President of Ireland, £266 in Ireland. If we want people to do the right thing and self-isolate, we have to make it financially possible for them to do it. So a message I'm sending out this weekend to all Labour Party members is, obviously, get involved in campaigns, but above all, support the most vulnerable people in our community in the crisis that they're going through. If this government won't stand by the homeless, those threatened with losing their houses, and all the other people that are in fear at the moment because of coronavirus, we will, and we'll be out there working with them and supporting them. I have to say, to me, it's an enormous, enormous pleasure to be invited to give the 20th anniversary Bernie Grant Memorial Lecture. And when Sharon contacted me to invite me to give it, I was quite overwhelmed because it seems to me only yesterday that I was talking to Bernie. He's somebody that's never ever forgotten, and so many people often come up to me and say, what was Bernie like? You knew Bernie very well. And all those people that have spoken before I came onto the platform this evening, I want to say thank you to them. But I also want to give a call out to late friend Narendra Mukherjee, and we had a wonderful memorial for him in this very building after he sadly passed away a year ago. Linton Kwesi Johnson's fantastic poem is amazing, and thank you, Linton, for that, and for all the other poetry you've done, and the way in which you've produced humour, thought and history all in a few lines. It is an amazing talent, an amazing skill, and I'm proud to be speaking tonight after you've given that poem. I want to say a huge thank you to David Lammy for what he said tonight, for his work as the MP for Tottenham, and the way that he speaks up in Parliament in support of the Windrush generation and against the racism, and exposes what Boris Johnson and his cronies are absolutely about. And so, David, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to work with you over all these years that you've been in Parliament, and we're going to be working together in the future on so many issues and so many campaigns. Thank you for what you've done and what you said. To Joe, the leader of the council, I didn't realise that there had only been 7 black council leaders in Britain. I knew it was a small number, I didn't realise it was as few as that. And 4 of those come from just 2 London boroughs, Brent and Haringey. What on earth has the rest of the country been doing? Do they realise what they've missed? Do they realise how wrong they were? And so let's make sure that is changed in the future. Joe, thanks for what you said and for everything that you do. And to my friend Roger, who is presiding over this evening's event, I'll make no comment whatsoever about cycling or hair this evening. We've had quite enough of that. Roger, as a great friend, former councillor in Islington, near neighbour to me, and wonderful Assistant General Secretary of Unison. I almost said NUPE there. I want to say, Roger, thanks for all that you do and the inspiration you give to members of our union when you go to events all over the country to speak up with them and for them. Thanks a lot, Roger, for what you do. And to Sharon, as chair of and inspiration behind the Bernie Grant Cultural Centre, I remember when you talked to me about setting up the Cultural Centre, I said I thought it was an absolutely brilliant idea. I wasn't quite sure how it was ever going to happen, but I realised if it was ever going to happen, it would only be through your energy, your determination and your dedication. Thank you for all of that. And also, of course, to the Artistic Director, Hannah, for what you've made this centre into. I'm very proud to say Bernie was a friend, a comrade and inspiration. And it's a real pleasure sharing a few memories with him, but this lecture is not just about memories of Bernie. David, like Bernie, is proud also of his Guyanese ancestry. Yep. So when I see David, well done, yes, and I've been to Bartica, when we see David standing up against racism, the hostile environment, the Windrush generation, Bernie is looking down. He'd be very proud. Because it is about remembering those that went before us. It is about remembering those that made huge sacrifices that others would be able to live in an environment free of racism. Tomorrow, I'll be on the Blackstock Estate in Finsbury Park, or Highbury Hill, tomorrow afternoon, where we're unveiling a plaque in memory of Andrea Levy, the chronicler of the Windrush generation, who lived and grew up in that era. And her novel, Small Island, introduces us this wonderful man, Gilbert Joseph, the RAF serviceman, who rues the day that he came back to Britain. He can list all England's major canals and industry, but at the same time, most British people couldn't even find Jamaica on the map. And so in the book, he asked this very simply: how come England did not know me? That's a question that could equally be applied when Bernie first came to England. He arrived here, Bernard Alexander Montgomery Grant, known as Bernie to all of us, but he was also called Monty. I never dared call him Monty, but some people did. And it's the Britain of small islands that Bernie arrived at in 1963. That was the time when there were signs saying, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. It was the time of sus laws, of Rachmanite landlords in London, Birmingham and many other cities, and the squalor they brought with them. It was a time of police brutality, and it was a time of the rise of the National Front, and it was only 5 years before Enoch Powell made his appalling, abominable Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 in Birmingham. And in the words of Andrea Levy, the streets that Bernie and the Windrush generation walked were not paved with gold, but some diamonds appeared on the ground in the rain. And I think one of those diamonds was Bernie Grant. My friendship with Bernie and his political career could provide enough memories and campaign lessons to fill the whole lecture series, not just tonight. I first met him in 1976 in Haringey. He was on the Trades Council, he was in the Union of Postal Workers because he worked at the International Telephone Exchange at the aptly named Mondial House. Others told me he never did any work at all because he spent all his time being a trade union organiser and shop steward. I think that's very unfair. He did some work, but he did a great deal of trade union representation, and he did that absolutely brilliantly. He lived in North Tottenham in Riola Close. We hit it off from the very beginning. We often argued because you couldn't know Bernie without arguing with him. He enjoyed a good argument, but he never held any grudge afterwards. Well, not for long anyway. Well, not very long. But, you know, he had that fantastic sense of humour. He used to turn up at my house sometimes in the morning, bang on the door. Jeremy, what are you doing? Why are you up here? I said, Bernie, it's 8 o'clock. Well, he should have been up because you should have known I was coming. Well, you didn't tell me you were coming. Okay, well, I'm here now. And then he would come up with the latest idea he had. Then the National Front began to get bigger and more serious, and they planned a march along Green Lanes, past Duckett's Common and up through the high road in Wood Green, and we decided this had to be opposed. So a group of us got together to oppose the National Front march. Bernie, myself and others. We organised this massive demonstration to try and stop them. 5,000 people came to that demonstration on Duckett's Common, and we totally disrupted the National Front march, and they were prevented from marching in That was St George's Day, 1977. And as Bernie and I were organising this event, it was during the GLC election campaign at the time, I got a call from the head office of the Labour Party at the time saying, what are you doing? You're organising a demonstration. It's going to clash with the election campaign. I said, I don't think you should separate the campaign against racism from the campaign to elect Labour councillors. They're not different things. They should be one and the same thing and part of the same process. And they said, well, wouldn't it be better if you just called off the demonstration and let the National Front march through and everybody will forget about it? Oh, yeah. So I said, well, that's a very interesting idea, but how much of German history have you studied? And the person on the other end of the phone went quiet and said, what are you on about? I said, well, what I'm on about is German history. They said, why? I said, think through. Those that let the Nazis grow in Central Europe were the ones that ended up being murdered by the Nazis 15 and 20 years later. You cannot allow fascists and racists to control our streets. You have to stand up against them. And a year later, Bernie became a councillor representing Bruce Grove on Haringey Council. And then he succeeded me as chair of the Community Development Committee. This was the committee that was the bane of the council's life because it had a budget of its own, and we built many community centres, and I used to spend a lot of time arguing with the Labour group that I didn't have a big enough capital budget, and this was a time that there was relatively more money around in local governments, and I was one year only offered a 20% rise in my budget for the following year. I demanded 25%. I threatened to resign if I didn't get it. So I compromised on 22.5%. But think it through. This is 1970s, a 22.5% rise in the budget for 1 year for one department. And from that, we helped to build community centres all over the borough. And Bernie carried on that work. And from that, we got the West Indian Centre and so many more. But it was about empowering people and communities. And as Roger said, we also worked together in the National Union of Public Employees, where Bernie was instrumental in equal opportunities policies, which sounds fine and simple and straightforward, but it's not. It's not fine and simple and straightforward. When you have a powerful union organisation in some departments of some councils, or indeed in the print industry or other places, where effectively the union can decide who gets the next job. Now, at one level, that sounds fine. That's power. That's power of a union position in that. But the problem with that is that mirrors the community that is already there. And that would end up with very few black workers in certain departments of certain councils or in other industries. There has to be an equal opportunities policy. Otherwise, you end up actually not setting out to do it, but you end up racially discriminating against a very large number of people. So Bernie raised this whole issue in the union. It was very uncomfortable for the union that he should raise it, but he did. And he changed the union's policy and attitude to all of that. And he then went on to work for the Black Trade Union Organisation, which was supported by the GLC in the 1980s. So Bernie was a far-thinking person who looked all this through and developed a lot of those policies also when he became leader of Haringey Council. And as Joe was explaining, he came under enormous attack after the Broadwater Farm riots. And I remember I was away in Cyprus at one point, and I phoned Bernie, and I said, "How are you?" He said, "Well, the press are really going for me." He said, "You once told me that all publicity is good publicity." I said, "Well, Bernie, I mean, there's caveats to that." He said, "You didn't have any caveats when you told me that." He said, "Have you read the Daily Mail today?" So I said, "Well, fortunately, it's not on sale here in Cyprus." He said, "Well, I'll keep it for you when you get back, and you'll see what it's like." But Bernie went through all of that, suffered all the brickbats that the media can possibly throw at an individual. Barmy Bernie headlines, all this sort of stuff, really vicious stuff. Yet, the people of Tottenham, the Labour Party in Tottenham, still realised what a gem you had in Bernie, and he was selected to succeed Norman Atkinson as the MP for Tottenham and elected in 1987, along with the other comrades at that time, Paul Boateng, Keith Vaz and Diane Abbott. And that was the most amazing election result. The first time since the 1920s a black person had been elected to the British Parliament. And Bernie was very much part of that and was an amazing contribution to Parliament. He was always involved in representing Tottenham, also, of course, but also international causes. And there are many I could refer to, but there's just one or two I want to mention. After the US invasion of Grenada, Bernie and I were very strongly opposed to it. This was 83. At that time, Bernie was a councillor. And we went to Grenada together with Nadine Finch, who's here tonight. And thank you, Nadine, for coming tonight and all the work that you did in supporting the people of Grenada at that time. And we went there and we met American soldiers that were part of the occupying force, and we tried to visit Bernard Cord in prison. We were denied access to prison. We made as much fuss as we could about it in rather difficult circumstances, and Bernard Cord was indeed threatened with execution at that time. And it was poignant to me that last year Bernard came to my office and he said, "You don't realise how important it was that Bernie and you came there at that time, because I believe I would have died but for your presence there." And I don't know whether that's absolutely the case or not, but I do know that Bernie was totally serious about acts of international solidarity. And he went to South Africa in 1990 when Nelson Mandela was released, and rather bizarrely was invited by Margaret Thatcher to give her a briefing on his visit. And I said, "Bernie, are you serious about this?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I thought you were joking. And she really asked you to give him..." And he said, "Yeah." And he went there and he just went through, point by point by point, what apartheid meant, what the living standards were of the poorest black people in South Africa, what the heroism was of Mandela and all the others in the ANC. And Bernie was absolutely part of the anti-apartheid movement. And so it was this global vision and view that Bernie had, but it was practical, it was on the ground, it was there, and it was using his voice in Parliament to speak up for those causes. And he, in 1991, when the Gulf War was the problem, the issue, pre-Iraq War, this was the Gulf War, and Bernie actually went to Iraq in order to try to ensure there was negotiations rather than killings and bombings, and pointed out that the occupation wouldn't go well for the people of Iraq. And then you look years later at the effect of depleted uranium weapons and the effect of cancers in southern Iraq as a result of that. Bernie was absolutely on top of these issues. And together, later, in 1994, we went to Uganda for the 7th Pan-African Congress in Kampala. And that was absolutely fascinating experience. And I remember so well, one big event we were at, there were various sisters and brothers from all parts of Africa talking at an economic session of the 7th PAC about industrial development. And then there was a group sitting at the back. I didn't know who they were or where they were from, and they very determined to come and speak. And the chair of that session maybe didn't see them as the highest priority, but they kept persisting. So they came to the front and indeed spoke. And they introduced themselves as representing the Rust Belt of the USA. They were all from Detroit and Chicago. And they said, speaking on behalf of the Rust Belt, these were their words, don't go down that road of just following the industrial strategies of Europe and North America. Jump a phase to high technology, jump a phase that will give a real hope and a real future for the next generation. Wow. So Bernie was across that, and he was also across the environmental issues that were being faced by people in Uganda and indeed many other countries. So Bernie was somebody that was there always doing things, and I want to just thank him for all of that. My last vision of Bernie was visiting him in the Middlesex Hospital. He was in bed in this room, surrounded by about 10 of us, sitting in a sort of respectful semicircle around the bed. And Bernie was basically holding court. He was sort of saying, Jeremy, what do you think about so-and-so? No, let me tell you. And everybody asked their opinion, then told them what he thought their opinion should be. And the nurses were clearly absolutely in awe of Bernie and running in and out with support and refreshments for him. And he was obviously in deep pain, and that was the last conversation I had with him. What a great friend, what a great comrade. I want to talk about two particular elements of his work tonight. His attempts to get Britain to understand our colonial history and the representation of black people in Britain, of which Bernie was a pioneer. He was a pioneer in the same way that John Archer was a pioneer, the first mayor of Battersea in 1912, that Saklet Vala was as MP for Battersea later on, as Dadabhai Naraji had been as an MP in Finsbury. And Bernie was a pioneer. And Marcus Garvey said this, people without knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots. This is a very powerful metaphor for the terrible impact of colonialism and enslavement. But in Britain, we are in many ways also a tree without roots, a people without sufficient knowledge of our own past history. I want to quote the late, great Stuart Hall. He put it this way: I'm the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. There are thousands of others beside me that are the cup of tea itself. Because they don't grow it in Lancashire, you know. That is the symbolisation of English identity. What does anybody in the world know about an English person except they can't get through the day without a cup of tea? Where does it come from? Sri Lanka? India? That is the outside history. That is the inside. That is inside the history of the English. There is no English history without that other history. He could not have put it any better than that. So, black history is British history. Why, in children's history classes, can we talk about Hastings, Trafalgar, Waterloo, and Dunkirk, but not the Zulu War, the partition of India, the Opium Wars, the Mau Mau Uprising, or the Morant Bay Rebellion? Why is it that when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we talk about the spinning jenny and steam power, but less about slavery or the violent suppression of whole swathes of the globe? Why is the story of the end of slavery so often reduced to a simple morality tale about a few white men such as William Wilberforce, however noble they were? The slave trade was an abomination, a tragedy on an unimaginable scale over an appallingly long time. At least 11 million Africans, possibly many more, were transported to the Americas. Around 3 million of those on British ships. And they were very small ships in those days. Think of the number of ships. Millions more died en route. They endured conditions painful to imagine, treated as nothing but cargo, chained by neck and the legs, packed so tightly that sometimes there was only room to lay on their sides, on shelves as little as 18 inches between them, for a crossing that lasted often 2 whole months. Disease on board the ships was rife, the stench was unbearable, the air below decks could be of such bad quality that candles wouldn't burn. From one description, I should warn you, this is extremely graphic. Alexander Falconbridge, a ship's surgeon, recounted how the floor would become so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. He described how the sick would have to lie on bare planks, and he wrote, "Those who are emaciated frequently have their skin and even their flesh entirely rubbed off by the motion of the ship from the prominent parts of the shoulder, elbow and hips, so as to render the bones in those parts quite bare." Sometimes up to half of those being transported would die of dysentery and fever. On one British slave ship, 132 people suffering from illness were thrown into the sea to drown. Because if they'd died on board, the owners of the ship would not have been entitled to claim insurance. And of course, those lucky enough to survive the horror of the crossing were rewarded with the brutality of slavery for the rest of their lives. Remy Capo is in the audience tonight somewhere. Remy? Thank you, Remy. Thank you for coming. And thank you for the book that you very kindly sent to me. He described the scene in this equally grim and shocking detail in his book, Reap the Forgotten Harvest. Remy kindly sent it to me, and I found it hard to read. And the part I want to quote to you is very graphic and beautifully written. Condemned, the slave was strung up by his wrists from the main yard arm. 50 lashes were applied. Then a hangman's noose was dropped around the neck of the half-conscious slave. Taking up the slack, the 6-man crew heaved. The slave rose up onto his toes, fingering the palpitating abdomen of his petrified victim. The captain turned around with a twinkle in his eye and grinned. "Forget the screws, Mr. Graceforth," he said. "I have a different scheme. I think this one has been belly worshipping." Grasping his sword handle, the captain drew a finger lovingly along its shining edge. Placing the tip of the sword at the top of the victim's pulsing ribcage, the captain turned with an evil grin. A queasy sensation crept into Wimborne's gut. Wimborne was one of the officers on the ship. Turning to the 6-man pulling crew, the captain jerked his thumb upwards. Trotting backwards with the rope, they yanked the victim high into the air. The blade sliced the belly open from top to bottom. Out gushed a bloody porridge. Twitching and groaning, the disemboweled slave swung back and forth with his entrails convulsing above the deck. Strangling in the fresh breeze, a trail of blood along the deck defined the full extent of this pendulum motion. It's impossible, absolutely impossible not to wonder, how could people participate in such cruelty against a fellow human beings for so long? And then you have to look at the economy of the time, and the answer is quite simply the money that was made from the sugar industry and the slave trade. Walk around British cities, Liverpool, Bristol or London. You will see the streets named after wealthy slave traders and grand buildings paid for by the suffering of Africans thousands of miles away all that time ago. That is the history that too many and too often in this country people are ashamed to remember. Bernie himself was not taught this history in school. His European teachers in colonial British Guiana did not think it appropriate. We see the results in the failure to understand and come to terms with it all around us. It's the failure to understand our history that results in professional boxer Vernon Van Riel, once a St Anne's Road and Chestnuts Road resident, going from fighting at the Royal Albert Hall to being deported to Jamaica and living destitute in a derelict shack. It means that citizens of Britain's former colonies have been converted into immigrants. When Parliament debated the Windrush scandal, the words illegal immigrant and illegal immigration were uttered dozens of times, as David so frequently had to correct ministers and Tory MPs in doing that. It results in this government chartering a deportation plane to take people to Jamaica, back across the very same ocean their ancestors had earlier travelled in shackles on those slave ships. We still do not know how many British citizens were wrongfully deported under the hostile environment. It must rank as one of the greatest insults in history that when slavery was finally abolished in parts of the British Empire in 1833, Parliament compensated slave owners for the loss of their property, while the victims of slavery described in this brilliant book got nothing. That payout to thousands of British slave owners, including a distant relative of David Cameron, was vast. £20 million. Or, think of it another way, 40% of the government's annual income at that time, making it one of the largest ever bailouts in British history. The equivalent share of government income today would amount to £300 billion. It required a loan so large that British taxpayers were still paying it off until 2015, when the hostile environment was in full swing. And just £62,198 has been paid out in compensation to 36 victims of the Windrush scandal. A reckoning with our past, our whole past, not just a manicured and selective history, is well overdue. Bernie understood this. He lived it. His experiences were deeply imbued in his politics. He articulated it. He represented, as Roger and others have pointed out, he represented not just his constituents, but everyone suffocated by racism and oppression. I've never forgotten when Bernie was first elected, he was overwhelmed with letters and correspondence and postcards and requests and demands from people all over the world who saw his election a little bit of their own triumph, and they were right. Bernie had enormous demands placed upon him. There have been some forward steps made. Glasgow University has started a programme of reparative justice in response to having benefited from slavery itself. It's established a new Glasgow Caribbean Centre for Development Research, which is to be run jointly with the University of the West Indies. It's renamed buildings and elected a memorial to those that were enslaved. Modest developments, but important. They're significant in breaking through what Afua Hirsch has described as the paralysis of fear and denial on this issue. So I'm proud that Labour has committed to improving the teaching of black history and the history of the British Empire, imperialism and slavery. I'm proud of the Emancipation Education Trust that Dawn Butler and I have supported and announced the launching of it in Bristol, one of the cities that did so well, or some people did so well in Bristol, out of the slave trade. And whilst we didn't win the election, we're going to take that forward because it's important that we have that taken forward at all times. And I'm sure you would agree, in the light of Windrush, this is more important than ever. We should know what went on around the world in Britain's name. And we should know where so much of the wealth of so many of our big companies and corporations came from. There's a brilliant book called Capitalism and Slavery, written by the late Eric Williams, who was the first Prime Minister of independent Trinidad in 1962. He wrote that book as his PhD thesis at the London School of Economics, and I first got a copy of it in Trinidad in 1968. Absolutely fascinating book, and it taught me so much. It taught me so much about the origins of the wealth of so many of our major banks and major companies in this country. And Bernie was a campaigner for reparations and other colonial governments to the global south who had suffered under imperialism. Bernie's whole speeches in Parliament were about bringing justice to the understanding of history. And he would have been, and he often mentioned, the great work done, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, by Walter Rodney. And he demanded that the British government recognise its crimes and apologise to all those people in of African origin for what he saw as the biggest crime in human history. He condemned the debts of demanded the debts of black countries be cancelled and that substantial sums be repaid to them to invest in their future. David Cameron did go to Jamaica and did offer to build a new prison. I think we can do a bit better than that. Because it's not just about history, it's about tackling the ongoing legacy of the outrage of colonialism. Since the 1960s, the form of imperialism that we see now is informal empire, ensuring that the former colonisers continue to control their old colonies so resources keep flowing from south to north. Why? Primary products are still the mainstay of the economies of so many former colonies in Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, and so on. And it's what Kwame Nkrumah was right when he called neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. And he wrote a great deal about that, both whilst he was president of Ghana and later on in his life. So when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank forced countries in the global south to roll back the state with their structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s, it was a disaster. The independence movements of the 1950s and 1960s had achieved that political independence, and Nkrumah particularly wanted to develop an economic system in Africa which gave some degree of economic independence to Africa. The debt crisis of the 1970s and later debt crises meant that the IMF turned up with its structural adjustment programs and the role of the state and the public sector was rolled back. So let's reverse the agenda of using trade and aid to trap the poorest countries at the bottom of the ladder, exporting crops and primary products, leaving people vulnerable to the lottery of fluctuating markets. And when you talk about the problems of services in the south, we're quite rightly concerned about the coronavirus in Britain, Europe, North America. You may not have read much about it. There's a smallpox epidemic in the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the moment. Hasn't had much publicity. They don't have the health infrastructure to deal with it. That is the imbalance and injustice of our world. So we also can't talk about international justice without mentioning the environmental and climate crisis. Tackling the destruction of our climate is a question of justice. The countries that have contributed the least to causing climate breakdown are those that have been hit the hardest by its effects. Britain and other industrialised countries must now step up and take their share of responsibilities, up to and including and beyond COP26 in Glasgow later this year. And as we develop new environmentally friendly energy technologies, we must make sure those technologies are freely and cheaply available to countries in the global south. It's about sharing the benefits we've got of high technology, not hoarding them in the north for a new form of colonial relationship with the poorer countries in the world. And we must stop international aid being spent on fossil fuel projects and instead make sure that international aid goes on development projects that are sustainable. And seek to engage with those, the receiving end of climate breakdown in the global south, who are leading the way and how to tackle it. I want to talk about the second element of Bernie's work. To me, one of Bernie's biggest legacies is often that of black self-representation. When Bernie wore a dashiki in Parliament to the state opening in 1983, that was black self-representation. And there's a wonderful picture of Bernie standing next to the Speaker's chair telling me off for wearing a very poor quality jacket compared to what he was wearing at the time. And he became also, as we said, the first black local authority leader and an MP elected because of the campaign for black self-representation. He was the first chair of the Parliamentary Black Caucus. That was black self-representation, which had come about because of the campaign for black sections within the Labour Party and understanding the need for self-representation. Bernie was the link between black communities in Britain and the corridors of power at a time when ethnic minority communities didn't have the voice they should have had and did not have the platform to speak out. He was the link between black communities in Britain and black communities, black nations and anti-racist campaigns all across the world. In all of these ways and more, he was a pioneer, he was a trailblazer, and he was an inspiration. To be proudly a black man in public life in Parliament in the 1980s was not an easy task. So I'm very proud that in his memory, as I've been concerned about levels of representation of the black community within the Labour Party and within our political system, we've launched the Bernie Grant Leadership Programme to address the underrepresentation of black, Asian and ethnic minority communities in Parliament, in local government and across our movement. And I was privileged to meet the first graduates of the Bernie Grant Leadership Programme recently, and they're fantastic people, and they are very much the future of our movement, our community and our party. It's a fitting tribute to Bernie's legacy that our efforts to empower a new generation of black, Asian and ethnic minority members carries his name. And 46% of the 2019 intake of Labour MPs. It was a very sad day, December the 12th and 13th, when we got the election results. But the silver lining of the cloud is that 46% of that intake are black, Asian or minority ethnic people, and 77% of the intake are women. So there is some good that came out of the 2019 general election campaign. So I look around me today and I see the representation in Parliament and the arts and our public life, and I think of Bernie. When I see Stormzy as the first black solo British headliner at Glastonbury, speaking truth to power with such grace, raising issues of racism in our criminal justice system, talking about how black people are held back from expressing themselves through the arts, hence this wonderful Bernie Grant Arts Centre, communicating how structural racism and privilege holds people of colour back in all walks of life. That is what black self-representation is about. 20 years after his death, I know that Bernie would be so proud of all those who are carrying on the struggle for equality and standing tall and standing very, very proud. Friends, centuries of barbarity could only be justified by inventing an ideology of racism that still poisons our world today. In modern Britain, black people are still hugely underrepresented in positions of power, politics, academia, and the judiciary. We must stop the cascade of prejudice from one generation to another. That's what Bernie worked for all his life to achieve. That example and that legacy of his struggle, is a gift to us. Bernie was somebody that enjoyed life, enjoyed company, enjoyed debate, enjoyed discussion, but above all, he sought to empower young people. The way in which he could meet young people, be they black or white, talk to them about their situation, about the problems they faced, on housing, on jobs, on training, all the difficulties they faced. And he brought people together to inspire them of what they could achieve together. Bernie was somebody that taught us all so much, and it was a privilege and an honour to be a very good friend to Bernie. And I hope tonight's lecture has brought back some memories to many people in this room that knew Bernie very well. In his memory, we carry on. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, so let's just have a little bit of reflection, a little bit of a discussion about what we've just heard. So I'm going to invite Jeremy to join us for the panel discussion that we're about to have. But also, can I invite a couple of other people to join us as well? Can I invite my Vice Chair of the Bernie Grant Trust, also trustee, campaigner for justice for the Windrush victims, and creator of the 100 Black Britons and founder of Every Generation Media, Patrick Vernon, to come down and join us. I'm sure I saw you, Patrick, somewhere. Look, if we're going to do this, folks, you've got to show, you've got to show us some more. We can make this elbow thing more funky, can't we, really, I think, Just going to put some body into it, I think, Can I also invite Sam Smithers, who's currently the Chief Executive of the Fawcett Society, to join us as well. Sam? Also, Jermaine Jackman, winner of Voice UK. Yeah, he only won because I wasn't in there, right, basically. No. Excellent. Okay, so it's time for some reflections, really, on what we've just heard. I think one of the big themes of that for me, really comes out about black self-organisation, black representation. That's also been where I first met Bernie as well, around the work of the Labour Party black section. So maybe some kind of thoughts on where we've got to on black self-organisation. Start with you, Patrick, maybe, where we've got to on that, some of the challenges ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I remember meeting Bernie many years ago. Grew up in Wolverhampton, from the West Midlands.
Yeah,
we had a branch, we had a black sections branch, and we used to meet in Telford, and then every so often we go down to Birmingham. Centre of the universe. Centre of the universe, still is, by the way. And so I've been involved in the party for many years as well. And I think if Bernie was alive today, what would he say? He would say to Jeremy, "Why are you number 10? That's the first thing.
Yeah.
But I know why, and we'll work on it. The second thing he would say is that great that we've got more female representation in Parliament, but also he would say, where are the black men? Yeah. Because apart from David, Clive, where are they? The Tories have got more black men, he'd be scratching his head, what's going on here? And the third thing he'd be saying, and which in Jeremy's speech talked about, that link with the community. And I think there's been a disconnect between Parliament and also to a certain extent local government, to be quite honest as well, and what was happening definitely in the 70s and 80s. There was a umbilical cord between activism and influence stuff. And and I think David's trying to bring that cord back in, others, and Diana's have, but we've got more work to do on that, and I hope the new cohort of MPs recognise that umbilical cord, the link between grassroots activism. And by the way, the reason why we're in Rosevette, no, I'm not a Lib Dem, by the way. I went to a funeral today of a very close friend of mine. Her name was Andrea Ensign. She was born in Manchester, and she lived in Hackney for many years. She was an activist. She was involved in so many campaigns on anti-racism and discrimination, and so we just laid it to rest today. And she's a big fan of Bernie, and she's definitely a big fan of yours as well, Jeremy, as well. And she believed in activism, and I think activism was the DNA of yourself, and you're still activists. And when people were activists back in the day, it was seen as a dirty word. Today, if you're an activist, it's like a cool celeb. I'm an activist, but actually, what does activism really mean? And I think that's a key lesson that we have to learn, not just as a society, but within the black community, and also within the party as well.
Thank you, Patrick. So, Sam, so you're Chief Executive of the Fawcett Society. What's your link to Bernie?
Oh, thanks very much. I used to work for Bernie, actually. Back in 1994 is when I first started working for Bernie. And actually, I'm a Tottenham girl, born and brought up in N15. And then moved to N17, and now I've gone all the way to N22, so that's how far I've moved in my life. And I know. But I mean, Bernie really opened my eyes, I think, to the importance of equality and inclusion, and also, you know, structural barriers to equality, and you know, the institutional racism and sexism that we see in our society. And that's why you have to have active interventions if you want to achieve equality. You can't just wait for it to happen. You can't just educate people into it. You have to intervene to make it happen. So we have a women's shortlist in the Labour Party. It's incredibly effective. Over half of the PLP are now women. But you know, if you don't intervene to achieve, you know, representation of black men, then you won't achieve that, actually. You have to have an intervention to make it happen.
So I remember people saying that to us years ago when I was part of the Labour Party black sections, that, you know, you should just wait for things to happen, you know. Things will gradually kind of improve for you, just got to have a bit of patience, basically. But Bernie and others, plenty of people in this room, know that without that kind of intervention being organised on the ground and making a noise sometimes, even when I remember the then leadership of the Labour Party not being particularly complimentary, to say the least, about what we were trying to do to bring about Labour Party black sections, and now many of the things that we talked about are just commonplace now, and you think it was their idea, actually. You know, maybe it was, I don't know, maybe we just got it from them, I don't know. Jermaine, so what's your kind of link to Bernie?
Good evening, everyone.
You can sing if you want, by the way.
Oh no, I'm not. I'm kind of get tired of turning up to a repentance and singing. Well, Jeremy always asks me to sing, but I won't be singing today. I guess I'm coming from the perspective of the future, and what does Bernie's legacy look like for young black men nowadays coming up into politics, who are really passionate about politics and really want to do something about their community. Just like yourself and Patrick said earlier, I've noticed, and I'm very passionate about the lack of black men in the party at the moment. So I kind of set up a group, reached out to a number of young black men under 30 in the Labour Party who are Labour Party members, and we've called it the 1987 Caucus. So, and obviously to represent Bernie Grant and him being elected as an MP. And it's about young black men sharing ideas, sharing resources, and coming together and trying to campaign and support one another and empower each other and create a safe space for us to have conversations about our political ideas. And those are also one of the steps that Bernie has inspired us to this day. And it goes back to that point, what can we use from the past to shape the future, and how can we build the future and from what we've learned from the past? And Jeremy used the term, a tree without a root. When we starve trees of their education, of their history and their culture, they have no roots. And when we think about, if we were to put a plant in a barrel, and we were to only shine a bit of sunlight through a small hole in the top right-hand corner of that barrel, that plant will grow towards that light, right? So what does that mean? What am I trying to say? A lot of the young people that I speak to, that I interact with, that I travel around the country talking to, they want to be singers, rappers, and footballers. Nothing wrong with that. That's okay. But you also have to ask the question, what are we constantly seeing on TV? It's great that we're seeing Stormzy and Daves and Raheem Sterlings, and that's amazing. But we also need to be showing politicians and lawyers and doctors. So if you only show them that light, that sunlight, they're going to grow to that because that's the thing that they want to go to. How can we lift the lid on the barrel, widen their horizon to ensure that the plant can look at and see a varied amount of roles that they can go for and grow in any way they want to? And those are one of the principles that And that's one of the principles that lays the foundation. Now, I've never met Bernie, unfortunately. I was 5 years old when he passed. not to make anyone else feel old. But I'm here representing the young people. Young people, make some noise. That's right. Great to see you in the room. But you guys, yeah, we're 25. Just turned 25 this year. But we are the future. And Bernie put forward amazing arguments. He fought the good fight. He was out there campaigning and protesting. I know, like, I was growing up trying to look for a role model. Diane Abbott came to my primary school when I was 6 years old. She inspired me to get into politics. Jeremy encouraged me to join the party at 11 years old. And when I discovered Bernie Grant and his politics, I was so excited that there was my parents are Guyanese, both of my parents are Guyanese, hence my Guyanese badge and my gold chain. Because you know us Guyanese, we like, where's David gone? Oh, he's gone. But it was great to...
There are other places around there, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Jamaica's amazing, yeah. Great for Jamaica. But it's like, oh my goodness, I'm of Guyanese heritage. Bernie Grant's Guyanese. His story is very similar to my grandmother's story of her being a campaigner and a trade unionist in Guyana, coming over here as a nurse, being an anti-racist activist as well. She passed away 2 years ago. But I'm carrying on that legacy as well, so that's why I really resonated with Bernie Grant and his story, and that's why I intend to carry out and continue campaigning.
Thank you. One point of disagreement. Not just the future, but also the present. Absolutely. Right? And I think it's really, really important that all the young folk in here don't just say, well, it's something that's down the road somewhere, but there's honest to God stuff that needs to be done now, where we need everybody involved. We face massive challenges, and I think if we just say it's for a small group of people to do, and others can wait their turn, no.
And just to add on to that, let's give the young person the seat at the table.
Yeah,
if we're talking about the present, young people are active. They know you guys know what affects you in your community. I see you nodding your head. You're passionate about it. So how do we ensure that their voices are heard at the decision-making table and they're able to participate in the future and shaping the future?
Great. I mean, can I absolutely turn to you now, Jeremy? Just, one of the big themes of your lecture was around internationalism for sure, but particularly around reparations and around slavery. I went to Ghana with Bernie long time ago now, yeah, and one of the things that we did was we went to Elmina Castle, which had a massive impact on me. To see a place where maybe my ancestors went through, maybe, but certainly a lot of enslaved Africans went through. And I was interested that you chose that as one of the kind of big themes of your talk, Jeremy.
Well, thanks. First of all, I should say that I gave the lecture this evening. I was very proud to do so. Quite a lot of people helped in preparation for it. We had quite a lot of discussions with people. And had I taken on board every very good suggestion that was given to me, I would be talking for 2 or 3 hours, because so much develops from when you discuss and go into the theme. I have always felt very strongly that somehow or other there's been a kind of airbrushing out of history of the brutality and the reality of the slave trade, and there's an exaggeration of the role played by British abolitionists. I'm not condemning them, because they played a role, and it was an important role. And I think the role that the Reverend Clarkson played, for example, in touring the whole country with his Clarkson's box, which showed what manacles were and how they were used against people. And I was invited to be one of the people putting on an exhibition in Parliament on the anniversary of the end of the slave trade. And we collected lots of things for this exhibition. And Speaker John Bercow was very supportive of holding it. And we held it with others in Westminster Hall. And I felt that somehow or other we've got to get this message out there, about what the reality and the brutality of the slave trade was about, and the industrial scale of it. I mean, you'll remember the numbers I gave in that. This was an industrial scale organised thing, and it could only succeed because it was brutal, because it was powerful, because there was a great deal of money involved in it at the end of the day. And there's a brilliant part in Remy's book when he describes as a sort of juxtaposition of the brutality of what's happening in Africa, where slaves have been captured, manacled and taken to the coast and loaded onto ships, with a debate in a club of slave owners, but they didn't call themselves slave owners, they called themselves sugar owners in London, who were discussing the problems of the sugar price at the time and how the problems that the slave uprisings were causing for the sugar trade. The abolition of the slave trade came because of slave uprisings in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Barbados, in the United States, in Cuba, all over. And it came also from opposition and wars in Africa, where unarmed or relatively unarmed African groups had fought against slavers that were going around dragging people off and sticking them into these actually European-style castles and forts. You saw one of them, there were others, the French and others built them, that were a whole system where you would bring people in, load slaves in, load them on the ship and send them off, and they had a principle that they'd probably lose 20% on the way, and the rest would arrive and be sold at slave markets. And I just think people have got to understand that. And it wasn't actually that long ago.
No.
In historical terms, this was still going on in the 18th and well into the 19th century, and slavery went on for a long time after that. So that's why I do think that Black History Month plays, yes, it is important. I fully support Black History Month. I think it's great, and it's a good step forward. But I'd much rather that a central core part of our understanding is about colonialism and what it achieved. And I remember, I'll finish on this because I could go on for a long time about this, the books that Niall Ferguson and others wrote, which were somehow or other trying to present the British Empire as this civilizing influence around the world. Compare that to an economic study of the effects of colonialism, which was turning an economy that didn't have steam, didn't have railways, but nevertheless was a functioning economy, into an extractive economy which fed the industries of the rest of the world. And that was surely the whole principle about colonialism, in particularly African colonialism. And I just think that has to be understood, so people begin to get an understanding. If all of our young people understand a little bit more about the history of this country, the popular culture of this country, the peasant uprising, and the solidarity that was often there of working class communities in Britain with the enslaved and with those Lancashire cotton workers who went through incredible hardship in order to support those that were opposed to slavery in the southern states of the USA. They went through incredible hardship by refusing to import cotton from slave owners in the United States. And that must have taken the most amazing leadership of those communities. And this was where the dissenting and non-conforming churches were very important in saying that everyone is a human being, everyone should be treated, because you can only support the slave trade if you dehumanize people because they're of a different group or a different race. When you've dehumanized people, as the Nazis did, you can get away with anything. When you humanize people, it's very, very different. And so I just want that history to be properly taught and properly understood, and that's what I hope we can do.
Just recently, we saw a play in Stratford at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was called The Whip. Extraordinary play, because it talked about the whole kind of process over the some of the debates, if there were debates. Actually, it was totally corrupt what went on within Parliament, where many of the parliamentarians who were voting to end slavery were slave owners themselves. So the money that Jeremy was talking about, they're actually voting to pay themselves loads and loads of money for them and their families. And then, not content with that, of course, what they also did was they said, we're going to pay ourselves all of this money. We're going to abolish slavery. We're going to pay ourselves all this money, though, to do it, because it's our property, because our ancestors were property, apparently. But what we're also going to do is we're going to say, but you're not free at the end of that, because you have to stay in this apprenticeship for 7 years afterwards. So we'll pay ourselves loads of money, but we'll still have slaves as well. Utterly, utterly corrupt. And you know, the fact that we only stopped paying for this, we only just stopped paying for this in 2015, is just remarkable, frankly. Utterly remarkable. But I'm going to, there's a couple of people who told me beforehand that they wanted to kind of say a few words. I'm going to bring them in now before I come back to the panel for a few kind of closing comments. Is Sheldon Thomas around?
The reason why I've come down here, I'm going to tell you something completely different to what these guys have been saying. I grew up in a time period where some of you in the room would know. At 9 years old, 1974, I went to the park and a police car pulled up and rolled down the window and shouted at Gollywog. At the time, I hadn't known the word Gollywog because I was 9, so I ran back home, told my mum and dad. My mum and dad's response kind of upset me more than the police. Because in that time, most West Indians who came over here were passive, weak, didn't educate us about slavery, didn't educate us about colonialism, didn't educate us about anything to do with economic suppression of Africa and the Caribbean, didn't give us any clear understanding of what we was getting ourselves into by coming to England, and believing that they owed England something. The older generation West Indians of the 40s and 50s believed that this was the motherland. But there was a new generation of West Indians growing up here, which was my generation, the 60s. And we didn't want to accept that. So that Gollywog, that word, was that one word that I heard repetitively over and over again. And it changed from Gollywog to Sambo to Coon to Jungle Bunny. The reason why I'm telling you this, that's what made me become a gang member. I became a gang member for 10 years. One, because I weren't loved in my own home, because my mum and dad didn't know how to love, because in those days, it was survival. My mum and dad had to survive here, so they had to put up with the language in order to survive, so they couldn't give love. So that sent me to the streets for 10 years. Reason why I'm telling you that is that Jermaine, that young man at the end, said something. And I'm going to tell him why there are no black men. We don't believe in the system. We have not seen any change for black men in this country under Labour or the Conservative or any party. No change. I don't know about anyone in this room, but I work with gangs. I go into places that will make your skin crawl. I go into trap houses where man's got guns and they're making drugs. Because their role models are the gang members. Because in society, we can't see ourselves. I've been waiting for I don't know how long to see a black man running the BBC. To see a black man, the head of Sainsbury's. To see a black man doing something other than playing football, as my man said. Because we grew up and was told by white teachers, you can't become a solicitor, you're going to play football. And when we went to play football, I'm going to tell you what happened. I used to play for Chelsea. 1978, I got in. only to be seen with banana skins thrown at me, abused. I went back to the streets. And the reason why I'm telling you that is that I think we need to wake up sometimes. I hear Jeremy talking about colonialism, and I hear Jeremy talking about money that should be paid back. But the one thing that we need to do if we want that to go forward, we need more unity amongst black people. We don't have that. Right now in Britain today, I can tell you 10-year-olds right now in Stratford, in Church Road, down in Arsden, in parts of Tulsa, who are 10-year-olds who are selling drugs on behalf of older gang members, and they look like me. Because society has a glass ceiling. Now what's this got to do with Bernie Grant? I'm going to tell you what it's got to do with Bernie Grant. 9 of my friends have been shot dead due to gang violence. The last one got his head blown off next to me. I've been shot at 20 times, if not more than that, by black men who look like me. And the problem in our communities, poor white communities and black communities, we don't take ownership for the self-destruction nature that we bring onto ourselves. And we think that politics is going to change that. Politics can't change that. We have to start looking within ourselves. I learned that from Bernie Grant. And I'm going to tell you how I learned that. Obviously, as you get older, you can't be in a gang, carrying guns, shooting people, kidnapping, torturing people. You can't continue to do that. At some point, you've got to reflect on yourself. I made a phone call to Bernie Grant's office. And I basically lied. I told him, I want to make a record. And I didn't tell him about my gang affiliation straight away because I thought, boy, he's an MP, he ain't going to want to associate himself with some brother from Brixton. Brixton was bad enough because he was from Tottenham, I'm from Brixton. So we already had a problem. I'm from Jamaica, he's from Small Island. We had a problem.
Guyana's bigger than Jamaica, just...
But to us, everyone was small. And the one thing I've learned, when I met Bernie, he turned up. This is what happened. We held the meeting, the very first meeting. And it was the first time black recording artists come together under my leadership. But I knew we needed something else, so I asked Bernie to come. No one thought he was coming, no one. Because he was an MP. He turned up, I think with one of his sons, which blew everyone's mind. I'm going to cut the story short because I know of time. I can see my brother looking at me. Personally, I should have been the one here talking. The manager should chill out. But we'll go into that another time. When the Labour Party is ready to have somebody real come up and talk, you call me. But Bernie Grant took a liking to me. He introduced me to his wife Sharon. He introduced me to, in fact, they brought me to your house, innit, on a regular basis. I was shocked because I never believed that MP would bring me a man like me to the house and sit down and eat food. So that got me thinking that this brother was something else. He wasn't normal. It wasn't normal because you don't invite an ex-gang member to your yard and you sit down and have food. And then on top of that, you invite him to the House of Parliament. And everybody knows we want to blow down Parliament. So my man's invited us down there. Anyway, cut a long story short, one day I got a phone call. And I think it was from that lady there. I cannot remember, but I got a phone call. Would I like to go to America to meet Jesse Jackson and the Black Caucus? Now, I'm in shock here because I'm thinking, why on earth would a man want to take an ex-gang member to America to meet Jesse Jackson? That's just not normal. And while we was going on the aeroplane, I didn't know that Bernie Grant was the first black councillor because you've got to understand how we look at things as black boys back then. We never believed that black people could strive to them positions. And it was through Bernie Grant that I began to realise not every white person was a racist. Because up till then, in the 70s and 80s, all of us thought white people were all racist. We didn't know the difference between the policeman or the National Front. We didn't know no difference. And so for us to learn from Bernie Grant that not every person, and the only way I'm going to get around that is to get myself re-educated. So when he took me to meet Jesse Jackson, the two of them sat down with me and started to talk to me about getting my brain wider. Because when you don't have education, you think narrow. So, I came back to England. I got a statistics degree, diploma in economics, diploma in management, diploma in business, A-level history, and diploma in accounts, all because of Jesse Jackson and Bernie Grant. They influenced my brain. The reason why I come up here today is to say this. Nothing's going to change in this society unless we start reflecting back on ourselves. That means white people need to reflect about not keeping quiet when racism's at the door. That also means that when black people get into power, don't mistreat the other black person trying to come up. And if you want to know the truth about why there are no black men, is that we don't believe in your system. And if you want us to believe in your system, we need the adults to start showing us the truth and being honest. And one of the things about being honest is stop deceiving yourself and saying England is a multicultural society, because we're not a multicultural society. Multicultural would mean that you can see us in every sphere of the environment, of the workplace, and you can't. So for me, I'm going to end, because this man's rushing me, I don't know why. But for me, multicultural cannot be used and should not be used, and especially should not be used by white people who have never been in our boots. Should not be used unless we can start seeing ourselves at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom, and not just at the bottom.
One word description, what Bernie means to you. Start with you, Train.
Inspired.
Cool.
Fun.
Yeah,
Actually.
I think that's it.
He was fun.
Emancipation.
Hope.
And for me, awesome. Can I, first of all, thank everybody involved in putting on this evening's event. I think it's been an awesome evening, don't you think? Yeah? Particularly want to thank Sharon, who did loads here. And can I thank everybody who's been, who's contributed this evening, of their time, their energy, their knowledge, their skill, their wisdom, their experience. Everybody, but in particular, I'd like to thank Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party. I couldn't hear that, that's in my bad ear.
I just want to thank all the youth from the Woodside Academy. You're our future, and it's united retain.
And you're our present, get involved in the movement, yeah? Can I just remind everybody that what I said earlier on about the need to keep this trust going, to keep not just the memory of Bernie, but to keep this work alive. So please do take out standing order, support the Bernie Grant Trust, get involved in the trust, speak up for the trust, invite the trust to come along to some of your events and talk about the important work that we're doing. If you've got links with schools, and then talk about the education resources that we've got, and the brilliant resources that we can start to raise some of these issues in our schools. So, most of all though, can I thank you all for giving up of your valuable time to come along tonight. Don't forget to buy the poster out there as well, signed posters from Linton Kwesi Johnson. Yeah. Thanks ever so much for coming. Safe journey home and stay well, stay safe. Thank you.